The problem with seeking to divine Trump's brain, it's a bit like trying to analyze the political agenda of yogurt.
Alright, so let's talk about Trump's latest brilliant idea, because if nothing else, he never disappoints in coming up with the most absurd, reckless takes on the Middle East. After meeting with Netanyahu the other day, he announced completely straight-faced that the US is going to take over Gaza. Just like that. Like it's simply a failing golf course that needs a new management. And apparently, while they're at it, they might just relocate the entire population somewhere else. Egypt, Jordan, who knows? These are just minor details which don't seem to matter. Now, this isn't just a standard Trump bluster. This is how Trump, and how Mouin once called him, the slumlord of failed real estate developer Prince Jared of Kushner, actually think. They look at Gaza and see nothing but real estate potential. Trump openly talked about cleaning up Gaza so it could be turned into the Riviera of the Middle East. As if 2 million Palestinians, most of them already refugees to begin with, are just squatters on a prime beachfront property. As if all that's standing in the way of a luxury hotel boom is some stubborn population that simply refuses to leave. And that right there is the real issue. Because this isn't just another Trump running his mouth. It's about how people like him and Kushner see the world. They don't see Gaza as a place with history, culture, and people who have suffered through decades of blockade, war, targeted assassinations, and bombardments. They just see a problem that needs solving the way you'd solve a messy business deal: clear it out, clean it up, build something new. And if that sounds like ethnic cleansing, that's because it is. Which is exactly why I'm talking with Mouin Rabbani today. If you know anything about the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict, you know he's one of the sharpest, most no-nonsense analysts out there. He doesn't waste time on diplomatic stuff or empty talking points. He breaks things down for what they actually are, and he does so in the most eloquent but quietly devastating way. Now, what's happening in Gaza isn't just another round of violence, another crisis to be managed. It's something bigger, something much more dangerous. Because when you have people like Trump openly floating the idea of mass expulsion, which is a war crime in international law, and when that idea isn't immediately laughed out of the room, then you know you have entered a new and very dark phase. So that's what we are going to get into. What does this actually mean? What's the bigger picture? And most importantly, what happens next? Because Gaza is not just some piece of abandoned real estate waiting to be redeveloped. It's home to 2 million people. And despite everything, despite war crimes, despite starving, despite occupation, despite blockade, those people are still there. And they're not going anywhere, no matter what Trump and Netanyahu think or cook up. This interview wouldn't have happened without the help of my friend Professor Asad Abdulrahman. He's not just someone who knows history, he's actually lived it, shaped it, and participated in it. If you haven't seen my conversation with him yet, do yourself a favor and watch it. The link's in the description below. One last thing. Critical voices like the ones you hear on this channel are being actively silenced and suppressed. You may not notice it, you may not know it, you may not even believe it, but it does happen, and I have the statistics to prove it. So if you do value sharp, unfiltered analysis that doesn't follow the mainstream narrative, hit subscribe, like and share. It really makes a difference. And for those who want to keep up with my work, make sure to join me on Substack. No restricting algorithmic filters there, or listen to my podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Amazon. The links are in the description below. Thank you. Mouin Rabbani, what a pleasure having you. How are you?
It's a real pleasure to be with you, Thomas Karat, and thank you for the invitation.
The pleasure is all mine. Now, I have a little a little list of your achievements here next to me, just to give the viewer who may not know you a little bit of a background information. So first of all, and that's interesting for me because I'm here in the Netherlands, you're half Dutch Palestinian. Tell us a little
Well,
bit.
I'm not half Dutch. Both my parents are Palestinians, but I was born and raised in the Netherlands, and I'm a Dutch citizen.
When did you leave? I mean, how old were
I
you?
I was born in Holland.
Okay, but I saw you speak Dutch. Or you write Dutch?
Correct. Yes. I didn't go to Dutch schools.
Yeah.
In the late 1960s, when it became time for my parents to decide which schools to send us to, we already spoke Dutch from, let's say, playing with neighbors in the street and so on. And the only other, and at the time, my parents thought we would soon be returning to Haifa, from which they were both forcibly displaced during the Nakba. And so they decided it would be better to learn English, and a British school was, of course, out of the question, given Britain's still very fresh history in Palestine. So they sent us to an American school system instead. So I speak Dutch. I'm relatively fluent, but I wasn't educated in the language. So at one point I was working for a Dutch organization, and I had to write correspondence in Dutch, and I would send it to the secretariat, and you could hear them screaming in laughter at the very elementary grammatical mistakes I would make. But it helped
But
improve my Dutch.
and you live in Amman, Jordan. That's my understanding.
No, I don't. I'm actually resident in the Netherlands, but I'm currently in Montreal.
Let me get this right. If you're not traveling, you're here in the Netherlands?
I'm resident in the Netherlands, yes.
Okay, you will hear from me again when you're here.
Look forward to it.
Okay, so just a couple of things of your achievements and specialties. So you're specialized in the Arab-Israeli conflict and Palestinian affairs.
Yes,
That's my understanding.
I'm a historian by training, although I didn't complete my doctorate, and my focus is generally on the Middle East, and specifically on Palestine and the Arab-Israeli conflict.
So if I look at your credentials, the list of your extensive credentials, yeah, you are co-author, yeah, that's current affairs. You're co-editor, sorry, of Jalalida. I hope I pro
Jadaliya, yes,
Shadalia.
it's an electronic magazine.
Yes. Contributing editor to the Middle East Report.
Correct?
You are host of the Connections podcast and edits the Quick Thought feature again for Jalaluddin.
Yes.
Resident fellow at Middle East Council on Global Affairs. Then the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies and Democracy for the Arab World Now. One thing I really would like to mention still, because I found it interesting. You were employed by the United Nations Office of the Special Envoy for Syria. Now, my question would be, why Syria? Why not Palestine? How is that happening?
Well, I was recruited, and you could make an argument that it made much more sense for me to be there than many of the much more of the non-Arab foreigners. I believe there was at least in the Geneva office where I was working, there was one other Arab, a Lebanese. I was recruited as head of political affairs for that office. But immediately upon my entry, it became clear that the office was a joke. It was basically, at the time, being led not by the weighty diplomats who established and subsequently ran that office. I'm thinking of Kofi Annan and then Lakhdar Brahimi, but by a clown by the name of Stefan de Mistura. And it's a long and sordid story, but I was basically recruited as a front for someone else to do my job. So I tendered my resignation within weeks of arriving and left after a few months.
I was wondering because you're quite an outspoken supporter for Palestine, and I saw that you have been in media, either in media or quoted in media as diverse as the New York Times, The Guardian, Reuters, Washington Post, Al Jazeera, etc. Was there, I mean, first of all, I mean, you were always as outspoken. So I saw quite a number of interviews in preparation of our discussion today, and your point of view actually pointed always in the same direction. But how does that reflect in a time where consenting voices, voices that contradict the mainstream narrative, are being actively suppressed and silenced? A number of speakers on this channel were actually examples in this category.
Well, I don't consider my own perspective particularly unusual for a Palestinian or for an Arab for that matter, or, for someone from outside the region who simply subscribes to elementary norms and values of justice and peace. But you're right, you can have these kinds of positions and attitudes with respect to Myanmar, Sudan, or Colombia, and it really has very little professional consequences, except perhaps that if you're good at it, you'll get promoted. But when you apply the same norms and values to Palestine, it's a very different story. Then you get blacklisted, you get canceled, invitations are withdrawn, so even solicited publications are rejected, and so on. And that's par for the course. My position is I don't ask to be platformed. I don't ask to speak publicly. I don't write unsolicited articles, but I generally accept invitations when I receive them.
From a behavior analyst perspective, one how should I say this, one weakness that I see in Palestinian communication, and this is where Netanyahu really stands out, is the fact that very often that Palestinian, so the speakers who represent the Palestinian cause are not very eloquent in the English language, right? And this makes voices like yours so valuable.
Well, I think that's changing. When the Zionist movement was seeking to promote the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, and during the first decades of the Israeli state, it's an immigrant society. And among those immigrants, you had many, for example, highly educated Jews from Germany, many Anglophone Israelis, and so on. And they not only had mastery of the language, but also had mastery of the culture and politics of their countries of origin. With Palestinians, it was, of course, a very different situation. We're talking about a society that was, until 1948, primarily a agricultural peasant society. It, of course, had important urban centers and did produce a number of well-known intellectuals and public speakers. I'm thinking, for example, of someone like George Antonius. Um, but, you know, until perhaps the 1970s or 1980s, um, uh, Palestinians who had a similar mastery of the language and politics and culture of the West uh, were quite few and far between. I'm thinking of people like Walid al-Khalidi, the late Faiz al-Sayed, and so on. But what has happened is that during these decades after the Nakba, the mass expulsion of Palestinians during the creation of the State of Israel, Palestinians began to attach primary value to what is transportable, in other words, education. And at a certain point in time, Palestinians were actually qualified as the most educated national group on earth that had a higher concentration of doctorates for example, than any other national group that had different reasons. But anyway, the point I'm making is if you look at the situation, for example, during the current crisis that erupted in October 2023, there has been absolutely no shortage of Palestinians who are fluent not only in English, but also in French, in Spanish, in Italian, and various other languages. People who have often lived for many years in these societies and understand them very well, perhaps even are born there and are citizens there. So, you make that observation, to which I would respond that I'm certainly not dismissing it, but one also needs to look at how comprehensively things have changed in recent decades, while at the same time, if you look at Israeli official spokesmen, for example, there's no comparison between their fluency, for example, in previous decades. I'll give you an example. The first time I went to the United States, I believe this was in 1981. There was a crisis that summer where Israel was conducting extensive air raids on Lebanon and Beirut in particular. And I was watching one of the Sunday news programs, and they were hosting Moshe Arens. I believe he was at that point Israel's ambassador to the United States and would later become Israel's defense minister. I missed the beginning, so I'd never heard of him. I didn't know what he looked like. I was a teenager, uh, and I so I missed the introduction. Listening to him, I had no idea I was listening to an Israeli. He was American born, spoke fluent American English, and spoke to the American public in a way that was very relatable for them. You look at the people who are performing a similar role for Israel today, and they're speaking primarily to a domestic Israeli audience rather than to a global or even Western or American audience. And that has, I think, multiple reasons, one of which is changes in Israeli society. I mean, most Israelis today are either Israeli born or were born in the former Soviet Union. Um, uh, Israeli society and Israeli politics has shifted very decisively to the right. So the kind of appeals that Israel could previously make to its audience of being all things to all people, of being a social democracy to European social democrats, of being the fulfillment of of biblical prophecy when engaging with Christian evangelists, of being, the outpost of Western interests in the Middle East when speaking to, uh, you know, people who were primarily motivated by the Cold War and so on. They can't do that anymore without violating their own moral code, which has shifted so decisively to the right. They can't even bring themselves to advocate for peace with a good conscience anymore. And that, I think, is a fundamental reason why Israel has had so much difficulty in its messaging during this crisis. Of course, it's a message. The message of genocide is impossible to market. I'll grant you that. But even then, they have become so radical in their approach and their denialism and so on that it's extremely difficult for them to pretend to be all things to all people, to put forward a sugar-coated version of reality that others would be prepared to entertain and accept.
You talked about messaging and influence. The whole reason why TikTok is under such pressure to be either sold or being shut down in America is because there is Israeli pressure in the background because via these kind of platforms, Israel can no longer control the narrative. and that's a massive. There was a Gallup study. I'm sure you know that shows that who older the audience is, the more they support Israel. The younger the audience, the less they support. That means in a generation or so, Israel will no longer be supported by America.
Yes, I mean that's another challenge that Israel failed to meet, which is understanding the changing landscape of global media consumption, particularly, as you note, among new generations. I mean, if you look at what's called the legacy media or the mainstream corporate media, the state media organizations. I'm thinking of organizations like the New York Times, like the BBC, and so on. Um, I'm not seeking to pretend they're no longer influential, but you look at their reporting, and it's not much of an exaggeration to say that their primary function has been as stenographers for Israel's version of events. I mean, you look at any BBC interview with a Palestinian or with a representative of a human rights organization and so on, if they mention genocide, for example, the BBC presenter, presumably because of very strict orders from management, um, goes, doesn't, basically seeks to contradict the guy. Well, Israel says this, well, Israel says that. So rather than listening to a standard interview with a guest who's expressing a point of view, it becomes almost like a debate between a surrogate for Israel's extreme right government and whoever's sitting in the interview chair. It's quite phenomenal. But then, you have social media, and you look at teenagers, people in their 20s, even people in their 30s. How often do you think these people go to a supermarket or a newsstand and buy a physical newspaper and read it the way you and I do or used to do? How often do you think, what percentage of their media consumption do you think comes from websites of these organizations like the BBC or the New York Times and so on? Um, Not that much, I believe, and it's decreasing. And their primary form of news consumption is through these social media websites, which are unfiltered and unmediated by the commissars and stenographers who have played such an important role in ensuring Israel's narrative supremacy. And I think Israel has been at a loss on how to deal with these things, and when what you get is indeed this totalitarian impulse. Well, if I can't control it, make it illegal and ban it.
We could discuss how free the social media really is now with sophisticated algorithms which understand the
Certainly.
context and
Well,
the content. So it's getting harder and harder. As a content
yes,
creator, I can testify to that. But
yes.
it's not as easy as it was in the not so distant past. CNN is losing rapidly viewers, even not viewers on their website. So the legacy media is in a crisis situation because they're getting caught again and again and again by fabricating news. So I never thought I would say this. On certain areas, I agree with Trump. These are fake. I mean, I make it very black and white, yeah. But they produce to some degree and sometimes absolute fake news. And the last example was this prisoner. Again, I'm sweeping over to Syria now. This prisoner who was supposed to be 20 years in a jail was being freed by in the presence of CNN, and then it turns out that it was actually the torturer of
Yeah.
that the prison
You're
camp
talking
wired.
about the incident in Syria.
Yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
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 So
And
if you get caught with these kind of blatant lies, fake news.
well, I have to say I feel some sympathy for them because they've gotten away with it on a systematic basis for so long. It's extremely difficult for them to suddenly reverse course and start acting as let's say one would expect professional news organizations to behave. I mean, the avalanche, the tsunami of fabrications during this current crisis has been overwhelming, from Al Shifa Hospital to the mass rape hoax to
40
I can go.
babies.
Sorry? Yeah.
40 babies.
Yes. Yes. And the list goes on and on. But what's interesting in this case, of course, Israel has sealed off the Gaza Strip to all foreign media since October 7th. There's been, a small handful of reporters who have been allowed in for a very limited period, basically embedded with the Israeli military. But other than that, um, the main source of news has been the Palestinian journalist community in the Gaza Strip, who've of course been systematically attacked, and some 200 of them have been killed. You've heard nary a peep from these legacy media organizations or from their top management, whether about being prohibited from entering the Gaza Strip or from the unprecedented murder of their own professional colleagues in the Gaza Strip. I mean, I can imagine that if this was in a different situation, that these news organizations would go to the government and say, if you continue to deny us access, for example, we will no longer interview your officials, or we will no longer report on your official press briefings and so on. But nothing to the contrary. But what I think is so interesting is that Palestinian journalists in the Gaza Strip who have been operating under exceptionally horrific personal and professional circumstances, not only have they managed to do an exemplary job of keeping the world informed, um, but I would also point out that a very high proportion of the reporting has actually been in Arabic rather than in English, and many, I think, a very significant proportion of what, for lack of a better term, we would call reporting, has been the live streaming of this genocidal rampage by its own victims. It's I can't think of another example if we just go back only a few decades to Rwanda or Bosnia. I don't think you had anything comparable where, for example, the population of Srebrenica was making available its its circumstances in real time. And of course, another key source of reporting, again for lack of a better term, during the past 15 or so months, has been the Israeli military itself. They are, they are so convinced of their impunity, rightfully so, because they have had systematic impunity for many decades. They are so convinced that they will never be held accountable that they are kind of gleefully celebrating their genocidal campaign and broadcasting it to the world for all to see. And here again, getting back to your previous question, it's a complete disconnect. These things play very well to an Israeli domestic audience, and Israelis have real difficulty understanding why these pictures of soldiers parading around in looted Palestinian women's lingerie aren't being celebrated globally. And the only explanation they can come up for that, is that it's anti-Semitism.
There was a landmark case by Professor David Miller. He was sacked from the university in Bristol.
Yes,
He sued
and
and
one.
uh, and won. And the judge said that you cannot equate anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. Yeah, of course they go in appeal. Yeah, but in first instance that was a landmark ruling. It's so interesting. I mean, you can call an orange an apple as often as you want. The orange will never become an apple.
Yeah.
So it's such a futile, but it's a perfect shield, of course, for any legitimate criticism
Well,
against the state of Israel.
I would slightly disagree with you. I would say it has been a perfect shield. Particularly in the West, and of course, particularly in Europe, and particularly in the wake of the Second World War and the Holocaust, um, to be merely accused of anti-Semitism was, it was the most damaging charge one could experience. Much worse than being accused of being a racist, um, uh, or any other form of discrimination. And Israel and its apologists had an extraordinarily successful campaign of fusing Zionism and Judaism. Of course, Zionism is a political movement, um, uh, most of whose adherents today are actually not Jewish, primarily Christians, then Jews, joined by growing numbers of, for example, Hindus and some Muslims and so on. But Zionism is a political movement. It's kind of like saying if you're against the Christian Democrats, um, you hate Christians. Um, so Israel, the Zionist movement, and and their apologists have been extraordinarily successful in identifying Judaism with Zionism, Judaism with Israel, and creating this belief, if you will, that a criticism of one is necessarily a denigration of the other. Um, if I condemn Israeli settlement expansion, it's because I hate Jews. If I condemn the Sabra Shatila massacre, I'm motivated by Jew hatred and nothing else. If I speak out against genocide, it's because I'm a Nazi. And they've been extraordinarily successful in that. But there have been changes. I think this worked most effectively against the older generations, those who either experienced the Second World War and the Holocaust, perhaps had quite legitimate guilt feelings about their failures, their personal and their moral failures, perhaps even their political failures during that period. People who were motivated by a entirely legitimate sympathy for the Jews of Europe after the Second World War. And the idea of being accused of anti-Semitism to them, it was a morally shattering accusation that helped. It was the commissariat at work, and it helped keep people in line. And there's nothing more disgusting than having seen Europeans, um, including Jews, who had records of extraordinary distinction during the Second World War, being denounced as anti-Semites. I mean, we were speaking of Holland. I can think of the late Piet Nock, who was a leader of the communist underground in the Netherlands during World War II, and helped lead what was known as the February strike, where sanitation workers went on strike in the Netherlands in 1942 to protest the deportation of the Jews of the Netherlands to the death camps in the East. And because of his role, he was given the award of Righteous Gentile by the Israeli state after World War II. And in the 1960s, he was very pro-Israeli, but then through personal experience and learning, you know, what was actually happening in the Middle East, he became a supporter of Palestinian rights and returned the award he had been given by the Israeli state at a public event where Israel's foreign minister, Abba Eban, was visiting the Netherlands. And for the rest of his life, he was denounced as an anti Semite and a Jew hater. I mean, imagine how despicable, how politically depraved you have to be to weaponize an accusation like anti-Semitism against, an extraordinary hero like Pete Nock. Um, and that worked for a while, but that's changing now because the consistent, systematic use of the false charge of anti-Semitism to defend an Israel whose policies are increasingly recognized worldwide, including in the West, as not only promoting apartheid, but now even genocide, has led to its trivialization. I mean, you have someone like Jonathan Greenblatt, who's the head of the Anti-Defamation League in the United States, what I call the Defamation League. I mean, this is an organization that used to conduct espionage on behalf of the white minority regime in South Africa during the 1980s, making very clear um, that their priority is not to combat Jew hatred, but to combat anti-Zionism. And in order to do this, they will coddle anti-Semites. They will give what the political analyst Matt Duss has called anti-Semitism waivers. So when Elon Musk gives a Nazi salute, Jonathan Greenblatt will come out and say that wasn't a Nazi salute. He was just waving at the crowd. Um, and so people no longer take this act, or I would, to be more precise, a growing number of people no longer take these accusations seriously. It's water off a duck's back. But it can and is still very damaging. And so, and I would argue it's also particularly dangerous when you have people who are genuinely motivated by anti-Semitism um, begin to pretend it's a problem that doesn't exist because of the way it's being exploited by Israel and its apologists. We know there is real anti-Semitism. We know that it's a growing problem as the far right reemerges in North America and Europe, and its trivialization is in this way to serve an Israeli political agenda is extraordinarily um, not only irresponsible but downright dangerous. And sorry if I may
Jonathan,
just add one point. And so what you see in response, when all these kind of Stalinist approaches no longer work, is that they're resorting increasingly to the law, criminalize this, ban that, make this illegal, make that illegal. And then they complain that they're the ones being canceled.
Jonathan Greenblatt, which you mentioned, is one of the driving forces behind the TikTok ban. I made a video about this. Yeah.
Well, I'm not surprised to hear that.
Yeah. If we switch over to Gaza, and if you allow me to say two things.
Please.
First of all, U.S. Ambassador Josh Friedman told me that the discussion, also for him, a ceasefire in Gaza is like giving a glass of water to someone who is standing in line for the gas chambers in Auschwitz. Yeah, that was, I think, 3 months ago. Yeah.
Mhm.
Then, when I heard about the ceasefire, so coincidentally, nicely fitting with Trump's inauguration, what I immediately remembered, where have we seen this before? Now, the inauguration of Ronald Reagan, because at the very same day that Ronald Reagan
Exactly.
was inaugurated, the Iranian hostages were released. So, do you think this is coincidence?
I can fully understand what Chaz Freeman, who's one of the best informed Americans on the Middle East, I can fully understand what he's saying. The hope is that if this is pushed through, it will actually not only be giving water to people standing in line, but turn off the gas supply. And even then, it's only the first step. But um, the other point, sorry, I forgot the
The
oh,
coincidence
you yes,
between
I've made this point myself. You know, Trump came into office. He did not want a foreign policy crisis on his plate on the day of his inauguration. And he certainly didn't want one that involved American hostages in the Middle East, and that would evoke memories of Jimmy Carter's last days in office. And Carter had just recently died before the inauguration. So the Iran hostage crisis was also, again, very much in the news. Like you said, he wanted to be a Ronald Reagan. And on that basis, he dispatched his Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, to the Middle East. Before he was even inaugurated, Witkoff held one meeting with
On a Sabbath,
Netanyahu.
huh? On a Sabbath,
Sorry?
on a Sabbath, on a Saturday.
Yes, that too. And all of a sudden, Israel accepted the ceasefire that the Biden administration had spent a year trying to sabotage by claiming that actually Israel was completely on board with it, and it was Hamas that was refusing to. So that, you know, yes, Israel is influential. Yes, we're not going to pretend the Israel lobby doesn't exist. But this one incident, I think, makes abundantly clear how this relationship works. The United States is a superpower and Israel is a proxy. And this idea that Israel somehow controls the United States decision making on Middle East policy is, I think, a sham and a cop out. But getting back to the ceasefire, so I think it's quite clear that Trump was motivated by his inauguration along the lines that you just mentioned. So the question then becomes, okay, he had his smooth inauguration. He was able to claim a diplomatic victory on his first day in office. Is that all he wanted? Is his attention span now coming to an end and he really doesn't care anymore what happens with this agreement, whether it's implemented or derailed or whatever?
He
Or
wants to clear out Gaza. He said it loud and clear.
well, I'll get to that in a moment, or does he have a more ambitious agenda where upon entering the White House, he realized that it might take more than 24 hours to resolve the conflict in Ukraine, and that therefore he's going to focus on the Middle East, where he still has unfinished business from his first term in terms of sealing a deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and which he's probably particularly enthusiastic to achieve because Biden had tried to consummate this deal and failed, and this is one more way, that the Trump revenge tour can show how much more effective Trump is than the Democrats. I mean, the problem with seeking to divine Trump's brain, it's a bit like trying to analyze the political agenda of yogurt. It's impossible to know what the priorities are, what the objectives are. So you mentioned this Gaza Riviera plan. I mean, I have my own theory about that, which I'll be happy to share with you, but I don't know if that's what you want to discuss now.
Well, I would really like to discuss Gaza because
Mhm.
first of all, it's brand new. I mean, yesterday the statement of Trump, he wants to take over Gaza, where he and his administration already backpedal. But before we do that, I would like to come back to October the 7th,
Mhm.
because only 6 days after October the 7th, the Israeli magazine Mekomit, well, they published at the 28th of October, they published a leaked plan, but the plan was leaked 6 days after October the 7th, so October the 13th. Yeah. So this is a complete plan to evacuate, expel all Palestinians from Gaza and by extension from the West Bank. So this plan predated October the 7th, which is why I said on a number of occasions, October the 7th was a God-sent gift for Netanyahu for a number of reasons. But that's on paper. But I interviewed the Swiss ambassador to Israel, and he said in the interview he was called and he was asked if Switzerland would end again a couple of days after October the 7th. He was asked if Switzerland would take 75,000 Palestinians. No, I
I'm,
just wanted to say this is probably not an isolated incident. Israel probably called all kinds of countries. What I want to say with this is, from the very outset, this whole operation after October the 7th has one goal: expel all Palestinians from Gaza, and to be very specific, also from the West Bank. And this is where I come back to the deal between Trump and Netanyahu, because Trump had to give something to Netanyahu, and my belief is he gave him free rein in the West Bank.
Yes, that is their objective, provided they can achieve it. Let me just take a few minutes because there's a long history here. Um, as you probably know, Gaza City is one of the oldest cities in the world, but what we know today as a Gaza Strip did not exist before the mid 20th century. The Gaza Strip is a direct product of the Nakba, the mass expulsion of Palestinians from those regions of mandatory Palestine that became the State of Israel. In 1948, the population of what is now the Gaza Strip tripled overnight from its pre war population of 80,000 to something like 240,000. In other words, you had approximately 200,000 refugees driven to the Gaza Strip. Um, Even before Israel's 1967 occupation of the Gaza Strip, Israeli leaders viewed this population, these hundreds of thousands of refugees sitting immediately across their borders, often within spitting distance of their former homes, poor, destitute, embittered. It saw them as a permanent security threat, and I would argue rightfully so. Um, uh, but rather than complying with its international obligations and enabling these refugees to return to their former homes, Israel began putting forward all kinds of initiatives to what it called thin out the population of the Gaza Strip. This goes back to the 1950s. There were proposals to relocate large numbers of Gazans and particularly large numbers of Palestinian refugees from Gaza to Libya, to Anbar province in Iraq, after 1967, and at one point even to Paraguay in South America. Um, but none of these initiatives succeeded in substantially reducing the population of the Gaza Strip. Um, but and there were a number of other initiatives after 1967, some forcible resettlement in the Sinai Peninsula that at the time was occupied by Israel, in the West Bank, making it very easy for Gazans to leave the territory and get work opportunities, for example, in the Gulf states, particularly after 1973, and making it increasingly difficult for them to return. What people don't know, just a slight footnote here, is that in 1967, when Israel first occupied these territories, it was during the summer holidays, and many Palestinians from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip were abroad at the time. Israel prevented anyone who was not within the occupied territories at that time from resuming their residence there. And the population of the occupied territories, its 1967 population, did not recover its 1967 levels until the early 1980s. That's how many people were forcibly displaced in 1967. Israel calls this ethnic cleansing transfer, or the extreme right calls it voluntary transfer. In other words, we will leave you with no option but to leave your homeland, and then we will say that you voluntarily left and will never be permitted to return. Now, during the 1980s, this came to be seen as an increasingly impractical resolution of Israel's dilemma. Israel is obsessed with demography. It refers to Palestinians, and particularly to the high Palestinian birth rate, as a demographic threat. Um, but ethnic cleansing really became the preserve of the extreme right and was no longer part of the mainstream agenda, even more so after the 1993 Oslo agreements, where rather than expelling large numbers of Palestinians, tens of thousands of Palestinians who had been displaced in 1948 or 1967 were able to take up residency in the occupied territories. That all changed after October 7th. All of a sudden, ethnic cleansing once again became in the genocidal hysteria that gripped the Israel after October 7th, all of a sudden, the ethnic cleansing, particularly of the Gaza Strip, once again became mainstream. The difference is that this time it was not only a very broadly based Israeli support for it, but it was an agenda that was embraced by the most powerful country in the history of the world, the United States. And the Biden administration actually sent Secretary of State Antony Blinken on a tour of Washington's closest Arab allies to make preparations for this plan. And it got nowhere because Washington's closest Arab allies categorically rejected this because they understood that any collaboration with the scheme would be an act of political suicide by them, given the resonance of ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in the Arab world. So that went nowhere. There was not supposed to be a ceasefire agreement because there were not supposed to be any negotiations. But Israel's military failure and then ultimately pressure from the Trump administration compelled Israel to accept the ceasefire agreement. And it is in that context that we then see Trump's recent proposal. My own view is that this was most likely an initiative that was whispered into Trump's ear and promoted by his son in law, the slumlord and failed real estate developer, Prince Jared of Kushner. And Kushner had this widely known interview in
Beachfront
Harvard
property in Gaza,
in
yes.
February 23. He described Gaza as valuable beachfront property, um, and and he at the time, rather than what do you call it, repeating Blinken's proposal of expelling the Palestinians to Egypt Sinai Peninsula, he said, yes, we'll remove all the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. And I know this won't be popular with Israelis, he said, but we will sequester them in the Negev Desert, which is within the territory of the State of Israel, on a temporary rather than permanent basis. The Israeli army will have its way with the Gaza Strip, demolish all the tunnels, systematically destroy the infrastructure, and so on, then basically turn it into some kind of cheap tourist resort. And then the Palestinians, rather than returning to their former homes from which their families were expelled in 1948, could then resume their life as refugees in the Gaza Strip, probably working as bartenders and prostitutes
Cheap labor. Yeah.
in the hotels Kushner intended to build in the Gaza Strip. So, um, but I think um, the assessment by Kushner and his Israeli friends that Israel had been immeasurably strengthened rather than weakened during the past 15 months, and the belief that, unlike Biden, Trump could bend Arab governments to his will, led to this proposal of, mass permanent expulsion of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip to one or two or many Arab or states outside the region. But what is so interesting here is that, in contrast to Trump's first term, the Middle East is a different place today. And if these Arab governments rejected Biden's proposal or rejected Blinken kind of behind closed doors, with Trump, they came out publicly and forcefully. The Saudi Foreign Ministry actually put out a statement at 4:30 in the morning, Riyadh time, strongly and directly and unambiguously rejecting this proposal. Even the United Arab Emirates rejected it. Imagine, who would have ever thought the United Arab Emirates would not go along with an Israeli American scheme to ethnically cleanse Palestinian territory? But it actually happened. Egypt, Jordan, they said this amounted to that this would lead to the abrogation of their peace treaties with Israel. And then all of a sudden you had Trump going back, first also, I think, primarily because of opposition from within his own base. He said no, U.S. troops won't be involved in any such operation. Then he said it would be temporary, and even though he claims that everyone he spoke to about this proposal was ecstatic about it, he has now basically put it on the back burner. And what I think has happened, and again, I admit this is speculative, is that, you know, Kushner came to him with this proposal, uh, only marginally more ignorant than Blinken. Trump said, "Okay, I'm going to float this idea. If it works, we're on." There was very considerable pushback, and now he's retracted. What is Plan B? Well, Plan B is to continue with the ceasefire agreement. And what you've had today, I was watching the news just before joining you, is that Netanyahu has now said that he's open to a formal declaration ending Israel's military campaign in the Gaza Strip and the release of additional senior Palestinians in Israel's prison system, who Israel has thus far rejected obtaining their freedom, in exchange for the Hamas leadership leaving the Gaza Strip. Now, this is obviously an attempt to rewrite the agreement, but it already shows um, that Palestinians have an important say in the matter. That when Arab states take a unified position and make their views unambiguously clear to Washington, it has a political impact. That's the real story here.
A couple of things. I start from the back behind because we cannot absolve Arab states of their complicity. It's
Oh, of course. Oh,
incredible
no,
from
absolutely
an
not. And
outsider's perspective.
permit me to interrupt you. I think a key issue, we keep talking about what Israel has done, and rightfully so, about U.S. complicity, and rightfully so, about, the Europeans who specialize in elevated rhetoric while reaching pluming new depths of depravity with their hypocrisy, and entirely so. But one cannot properly tell the story of what has happened to the Gaza Strip during the last 15 months without giving a starring role to Arab inertia. Um, you can say what you want about Netanyahu and Biden and von der Leyen and all the rest of it, but I am entirely convinced that if the Arab governments had made clear to Washington that this has to stop and that there will be consequences if it doesn't, this would have ended long ago. And I'm sorry for interrupting you, but I just like to give one brief anecdote. People keep um, comparing Biden's attitude during the Gaza genocide to the position taken by Ronald Reagan during Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon, this well known incident where Reagan called the then Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, after having seen pictures of shredded children, told Begin, I think his words were, "This Holocaust has to stop." And of course, Begin got all excitable and outraged. And then, 24 hours later, the bombing stopped. Well, it wasn't the pictures of shredded Palestinian children that ultimately convinced Reagan. What happened is that the Saudi crown prince at the time, Prince Fahd, called Reagan and told him, Israel's war in Lebanon and your support for it is putting our regime and those of others allied with Washington in an increasingly difficult position. And if it doesn't stop, our security and stability is going to be negatively affected. Boom. And there, we don't need to discuss why that didn't happen this time, but it demonstrates quite clearly that it could have happened. And the proof that it could have happened is exactly what we were just discussing about the demise of the Gaza Riviera proposal.
It's so incredible. It's hard to even to comprehend. But very briefly, Trump's proposal. I mean, the two main target countries were, of course, Jordan and Egypt.
Yes.
Now, both countries. I mean, anyone with a basic understanding of the region and the situation would know that for Egypt it's a problem because they fear that the Palestinians affiliate merge with the Muslim Brotherhood, which General Assisi already is trying to suppress as hard as he can. And in regards to Jordan, I was in Jordan myself a couple of months ago. I interviewed four top diplomats, one of which was the former foreign minister, Dr. Marwan Washer, and all four said the same thing. They were concerned about the very scenario that that Trump just was describing by expelling all Palestinians into Egypt and into in Jordan. For Jordan, it makes it specifically interesting because there is another story behind the story, which is also not new, that Israel would encourage the Palestinians in Jordan to topple the monarchy and make it the Palestinian state. So make Jordan the
The alternative
Palestinian state.
homeland scenario.
Exactly. So the monarchy, the king Abdullah II, he is fighting for his own survival by putting the tanks on the border with Gaza.
Yeah, I'd put it slightly differently. You're entirely correct that Egypt would see the influx of millions of Palestinians as a security threat to Egypt, and that Jordan would see it not only as a security threat, but also as a threat to its domestic stability, given tensions between various parts of the Jordanian political arena. But that's not the main reason, I think, that they are so alarmed by this proposal. I think the main reason is that they recognize that if they are seen as collaborating with an Israeli American scheme to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from their homeland into their own territory, they would be signing their death warrants. They would be engaging in a premeditated act of political suicide. Um, because of the history here, because of the resonance of ethnic cleansing, which has become so central to Arab perceptions of Palestine and of their solidarity with the Palestinian people. So, of course, these security concerns, if we can call it that, are important. And I'm sure that in their dialogue with the Americans, that will be what Jordanian and Egyptian officials emphasize. But I think the primary reason is what I've just mentioned, rather than concerns about the Muslim Brotherhood or domestic instability. They understand, if you take Jordan, um, King Abdullah's great grandfather, King Abdullah the First, as detailed by the Oxford British Israeli historian Avi Shlaim, colluded with the Zionist movement during the 1930s and 1940s, and ultimately to prevent the establishment of an Arab state in Palestine, so that Jordan could annex that territory. He paid for it with his life. Um, King Abdullah's father, King Hussein, was almost overthrown in 1956 for similar reasons. So, you know, um, uh, in Egypt, King Farouk lost his throne in 1952 in significant part because of his failures during the 1948 Palestine War. Um, the first coup in the Middle East, and in fact, the first foreign coup to ever be supported by the CIA, was the coup by Hosni Zaim in Syria in 1949, which also took place in the context of of the aftermath of the Nakba. So I could go on, but I think the point is clear that Arab leaders Yes, they can be very loyal to Washington. Yes, many of them want excellent relations with Israel and even see Israel as a security partner, but not to the point of committing political suicide. That's a bridge too far for them.
We are on top of the hour, and I know you have a hard stop. I would have a last question in regards to where you see now ceasefire, no ceasefire, cleaning out Gaza, America, not, yeah. But before I do, a quick comment. Because Nakba, the word has now fallen a couple of times. I interviewed two survivors of the 1948 massacres in Datura, one in Germany and one, as you know, in Amman.
Sorry, you said in Tantura?
Yeah,
Yeah.
two survivors
Mm.
from the same family, a gentleman 90 plus years who lives still in Germany, and a lady also 90 plus years who lives in Amman and is related to Assad Abdul Rahman.
Yeah.
And I interviewed both of them. Now, if we compare what really happened, I mean, I know the comparison is not a straight one between the Second World War and what happened in the Nakba, but for people to understand why it is such a emotional, how should I say this best? There's so much emotional involvement here. Remembering in Nakba that people we here in the West cannot make us a mental image from. It had everything with mass executions, mass graves, dug by the victims, shooting the victims, rapes, everything. This is what we talk about when we talk about the Nakba.
Yes.
And the survivors of this atrocity are now the people that we're talking about today. And I think this is a lack in fundamental understanding of most people here in the West.
Look, you don't have to make any comparisons between the Nakba and the Holocaust to accept that regardless of the very substantial differences between these two events, that the Nakba has a resonance among Palestinians and a symbolism among Palestinians and has created a trauma among Palestinians that is virtually indistinguishable from the resonance of the Holocaust among Jews and the trauma it has caused by them. You know, we're talking about uh, probably tens of thousands of dead in the Nakba versus 6 million or so Jews in the Holocaust. But in the Nakba, Palestine was destroyed. The entire population was dispossessed. Palestinians were transformed into a stateless people, into a nation of refugees. They lost their homeland. And that's why I say the resonance, the symbolism, the trauma is virtually identical without having to draw any direct comparison between these two events. The interesting thing here is that Israel has, for almost 8 decades, very successfully used the Holocaust as a shield to deflect criticism of the Nakba and, even more importantly, of its ongoing policies of dispossession of the Palestinian people. And I think the key difference since October 2023 is that it can no longer do so. It is now Israel that stands before the International Court of Justice accused of genocide. You know, when you're a genocidal state, it's virtually impossible to defend it by saying, yeah, but we're the real victims here.
Which they're trying.
Sorry? Yeah,
This is
yes. Oh,
the
yes.
strategy, yeah.
Yes.
The perpetual victim. Yeah. But again, coming back to Gaza one last time. So, and I know both of us we do not have a crystal ball. Now, Trump apparently and his administration has pedaled back. Yeah, so it was meant to be temporary, and it was meant to be, a kind of humanitarian aid, exactly like this leaked plan that I mentioned before,
Mhm.
already mentioned. Yeah. So, in your perspective, where does this go? Where do we go from here?
Well, the agenda here, I think, is quite clear. It is to transform the question of Palestine from a political question um, uh, whose resolution has to be based upon the inalienable right of self-determination of the Palestinian people to a humanitarian question where you deal with these people's poverty, unemployment rates, health issues, and so on. That's really what I think is going on. It's an effort to once again transform the Palestinians into a humanitarian rather than political question. In response to your question, where do we go from here? We'll find out, I suspect, sooner than later, because only one of these two perspectives can emerge on top. Israel has failed militarily in the Gaza Strip, and the unanswered question is, will it also fail politically? There are reasons for optimism when looking at what happened with the Gaza Riviera proposal in the space of less than a week, but it's going to be a long and difficult struggle.
Mouin Rabbani, it was really my pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
If you made it that far, congratulations, you are ahead of the pack. If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. It really makes a difference. And if you want to get the even deeper analysis, make sure you follow me on Substack. In my Substack newsletters, I dig even deeper. I break down tricky ideas, show you practical analytical techniques, and I explain how you can use them in your own life. It's free, the link's right below, and I would love for you to join the conversation. Let me know how it's changing the way you look at the world and its people. As always, thanks for your support and see you next time.